Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and this week, looking at some just really awful ways that people have died throughout history. Now, I know we deal with death a lot on this show, with serial killers and just doing some real heinous things. But this week, talking about three individuals who died very awful, painful deaths. And we are looking at the stories of György Dózsa, Marco Antonio Bragadin, and our first story after the break is of Arius. Arius was a Christian theologian who lived in Europe and Egypt during the 3rd and 4th century. So we are going way back to three-digit years to start this episode. Here's the thing about Arius. Details of his personal life, though, are pretty non-existent because this guy, as an early Christian theologian, was making enemies with a lot of the influential religious leaders of his day, which ended up resulting in the destruction of all of his biographical records. It was one of those things where it was writing stuff down was obviously the primary way to communicate stuff. And if anyone ever disagreed with you, all of your stuff got burned. And so, it didn't matter if you were super smart. It didn't matter if you discovered something new. If religious leaders at the time hated you, your stuff was just gone. And God knows how much early intellectual stuff was lost and how much that kind of set humanity back because that was how people responded to things. But when it comes to Arius, we do know began in the year 311 when he began supporting Meletius's notion that Christians who had renounced their faith due to fears of being tortured by the Romans could actually be reinstated to the church. And this was a pretty radical idea, right? So Arius, this guy Meletius, they're basically hey, listen, God is a pretty understanding guy. And so if the Romans show up at your house and demand for you to renounce your faith, otherwise they're going to torture you to death, and you say, oh, yes, I renounce my faith, we think that you can still be allowed back into the church because that's reasonable. And Bishop Peter of Alexandria was no, once you say you're out, you're out. And you also stay out. And anyone who believes that, Arius included, would be excommunicated from the church for those beliefs. It's just so stupid. You could get excommunicated from the church for anything. And that was back when that meant a lot. Because if you got excommunicated from the church, that pretty much you pretty much thought that you were gonna burn in hell forever, and that God himself hated you. And that probably really wasn't the case, but that's what happened. But however, 2 years after his excommunication, Arius was then readmitted by Bishop Peter's successor, Achilles. Even more, Arius was actually made a head pastor of one of the districts in Alexandria, Egypt, because, look, even though God doesn't change his mind, clearly his divinely chosen earthly leaders can, obviously. Soon after Arius took his new position as a head pastor, he then got into more trouble when he insisted that the Holy Trinity wasn't actually a thing. And if you're unfamiliar with Christian theology, the Holy Trinity is this idea that God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are basically three forms of the same being, but they're different. And that concept is not explicitly laid out in the Bible anywhere. It was a new concept that came up in, a couple of centuries after, Jesus's time and the letters of Paul and all of that. And Arius knew that. And he's hey, this whole Trinity thing, it's not biblical. It's not real. And that went against official church doctrine. And, Arius, by his logic, he claimed that the Logos, which is identified in the first chapter of the Gospel of John, I think, and it's, Logos is the thing through which all things are made, i.e. God, had a beginning, right? So now he's also saying that God had a beginning, whereas beforehand, everyone was just like, yeah, God's just always been. He created the universe, but he was around long before the universe, and he's just always been there forever. And Arius is like, no, man, like everything has to start somewhere. Everything has a beginning. And so because of that, he was arguing that Jesus had a separate beginning because Jesus obviously had a birth date. He was born, and Arius constituted that as its own separate beginning, thus making Jesus a separate entity from God, right? The rest of the Christian world, when they found out about what Arius believed, they lost their minds. Like, they could not believe this guy was challenging what the head of the church was saying, because the head of the church is like the direct line to God. Like, God speaks through them. Like, they've got it all right. And Arius is just like, nah, man, you don't got it all right. And everybody's just grabbing their popcorn, seeing what happened. Well, after the Bishop of Alexandria exiled Arius because of his beliefs, the First Council of Nicaea was formed to come to a formal opinion and a formal position on Arius's teaching, among other things. The Council of Nicaea did a couple of other things as well. You've probably heard of it if you studied theology. One thing it did not do that's a common misconception is they did not come up with the books of the Bible. They were just establishing official church position on various Christian doctrines. But part of this Council of Nicaea, a group of 22 bishops from around the Roman Empire, led by Eusebius of Nicomedia, traveled to the council hearings to support Arius. However, when some of Arius's writings were read out loud, many of the participants of the council denounced them as blasphemy, almost as if like no one had actually heard his teachings before, because like communication was just so awful. Like, they come into this council and like one guy's like, hey, there's this guy Arius. He kind of sucks. We need to talk about it. And then they read his stuff out loud and they're just like, oh no, he's going against what the bishop said. We can't have this. He's a terrible person. Anyway, so this went on for 2 months. I mean, there was 2 months of very intense debate about what Arius was teaching and whether or not it was true or had some kind of foundation in theological teaching. But after 2 months, the Nicene Creed of 325 was established, which officially interpreted Jesus and God as being different forms of the same being. So essentially it upheld the doctrine of the Trinity. But because like early church debates and councils couldn't just let winners and losers go their separate ways, Arius and two of his most devout supporters, Theonas and Secundus, were exiled to the Roman province of Illyricum. Yeah, Illyricum. And that's really not super uncommon. It happened. A lot of people get exiled. Like, he's already been excommunicated, exiled once. He got brought back in. Well, after a succession of deaths in the empire hierarchy, Arius was eventually allowed to return home. However, during his time in exile, Arius continued to actually spread his own doctrine. And by the time he was allowed to return home, the concept of Arianism had exploded throughout the empire. Now, this is not to be confused with the other Arianism, which is what gave rise to Nazism and all that fun stuff, right? Like, there's, Arianism that was done by Arius is spelled Arianism, not Hitler Arianism, which is Aryanism. It's very different. Two completely different things, right? For lack of a better term, the good Arianism is seen today in the form of the Jehovah's Witnesses, who have spent their entire lives not celebrating birthdays or Easter or Christmas because there's something within Arius's teachings about that. But that is kind of the modern day influence of, Arius and where his teachings have come. It's the Jehovah's Witnesses. Bishop Alexander, however, was not happy that Emperor Constantine had allowed Arius to return home, especially since Constantine had actually previously ordered all of Arius's written works to be burned. So Bishop Alexander spent a lot of time praying to God that Arius would die before he made it back home. Unfortunately, for the bishop, Arius did make it back home. Things were going great for a while, but the bishop did kind of get his wish, right? So now we're finally to the actual meat of the story. There's a lot of backstory there for Arius, but there's a reason why he is a part of history other than this next part. On a Saturday afternoon in 336, Arius was kind of parading through town with just a throng of supporters. And when he came to Constantine's Forum, which is a big building, in, I think, Constantinople, Arius was stricken with a severe case of the bubble guts and started asking around, like, if there was a restroom nearby where he could kind of take care of the problem, get back to meeting his supporters. But once he got out of sight, found a private little spot, Arius passed out and lost all control of his bowels. And the distress was so bad, according to Socrates Scholasticus, which, what a name, right? You got to be a historian or do something in academics with that kind of name. But this historian, this was so bad that according to Socrates Scholasticus, Arius's small intestine, spleen, and liver shot out of his body, killing him instantly. Like, I don't know how that's even humanly possible. How your liver and your spleen, which are outside of your colon and small intestine, would somehow get inside of your colon and small intestine. Like, I don't know, maybe like your stomach acid leaked, burned a hole into your intestine, and then disconnected your liver. I don't know how it works, but liver, spleen, small intestine just shot out of Arius's butthole and obviously killed him, because you can't live without your liver, at least. But just an insane way to die, right? Probably like cholera, like a severe case of cholera or dysentery or something like that. But man, it's crazy. Our next story here of György Dózsa. I think that's how you say it. He's Hungarian. I think that's how you say it. We're going with it. But he wasn't Hungarian. He was a hired soldier for the Hungarian army during Hungary's wars against the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s. His reputation for being courageous in battle led to his appointment to lead an entire company in a crusade against the Ottomans in 1514. A few weeks after his promotion, Dózsa had amassed an army of 40,000 peasants, students, friars, and parish priests under the guise that the Ottomans were the enemy and would fully oppress all of the Hungarians if they didn't defend themselves, which wasn't entirely true. But Dózsa did a good job of like convincing people that this was what was going to happen if they didn't help. But shortly after he trained his army, they began complaining about their social status because, like, yeah, he's got peasants, friars, parish priests, students. Like, these are the lowest people of the social classes at the time. And they started realizing, like, oh, no. The upper class Hungarians were the actual enemy because they got us into this issue to begin with. And now they're just hiring people to fight their war for them, which, yeah, that's exactly what was happening. And to make things worse, the Hungarian government had failed to supply Dózsa's army with proper food and clothing. And when the peasants' landlords then commanded that the soldiers return to their farms and harvest the crops instead of going off to war, tensions got a little bit higher. And then the peasants refused to return. So the landlords started going to the peasants' homes and began abusing the wives and children who had to stay behind because their husbands were off at war. So tensions continued to grow between both sides, to the point that the crusade ended up getting canceled over fears of a Hungarian peasant rebellion. But the peasants weren't about to let all of their newly acquired war equipment and training go to waste. Dózsa, who by now had just been mentally and emotionally beaten down by all of the complaining that they were doing, he gave up on trying to reason with them and like encourage them and rally them. He was just like, you know what? Fine. we'll do it your way. And so he leads the peasants across Hungary, burning all of the castles and giant manor houses of the Hungarian elite. Thousands of upper class people were captured and impaled and crucified across this like war path that they were generating. And with little resistance, but a ton of support from the families of these soldiers, the army's numbers grew exponentially to where now it is a full-on like peasant rebellion. King Vladislaus II commanded the peasants to return home under threat of execution. And to make sure that they knew he was serious, the king ended up hiring mercenaries from Venice, Bohemia, and the Holy Roman Empire to squash this growing rebellion. But Dózsa, to his credit, he had kind of developed this sort of like, if you can't beat them, join them stance. And so he kept fighting. The peasant army captured the city of Sanad and impaled the bishop of the city's castle, kind of like as a response to the king, like, yeah, we're not listening to you. We're going to keep doing this. Well, by the summer of 1514, Dózsa and his army had captured the cities of Arad, Lipa, and Vilagos, taking cannons and trained gunners along the way. You know, like he's capturing all these cities. These cities have their own hired mercenaries to defend it. Dózsa comes in, convinces those hired mercenaries to just join his side because they've got all the momentum, right? The wealthy people, they don't have means to defend themselves other than hiring someone to do it for them. So it was pretty easy going. By then, the Hungarians had made it their priority, like the Hungarian nobility had made it their priority to stop Dózsa and his rebellion. Like they'd completely forgotten about the Ottoman Empire at this point. Like they were dealing with their own problems. And the two sides eventually met at Temesvar, where 20,000 Hungarian soldiers easily defeated Dózsa's forces. And Dózsa had way more soldiers than the official Hungarian army did, but the Hungarian army just had better equipment, better protection, better training, stuff like that. After the battle here, Dózsa was captured and sentenced to death, but rather than just outright kill him, Dózsa was forced to sit on a scalding iron throne, like naked. So like they superheat this iron throne and just make him like park his tush right on it. And then a heated iron crown was forced on his head. And like, that's enough, right? Like that's pretty terrible. But they weren't, like the Hungarians weren't about to let a bunch of peasants lead a revolution. And so they had to make an example out of Dózsa to make sure that they scared the rest of the peasants into like falling in line and doing what they were told. So as Dózsa was just searing on this iron throne, a line of 9 other rebels were marched in. One of them being Dózsa's younger brother, Gergely, who was marched in front of Dózsa and was literally cut into 3 pieces right in front of him. And that was after the Hungarians had promised Dózsa that Gergely would be spared. And obviously they lied, and they literally cut his brother, like just sliced him into 3 pieces right in front of him. The executioner then grabbed a pair of pliers that was like being heated in the fire and just pressed them into Dózsa's exposed skin. After a few minutes, obviously the pliers had burned into the skin, leaving a large wound of exposed flesh. The remaining 8 rebels that had been brought in were then ordered to bite the wound and consume the flesh they had bitten off. They are literally forcing these peasant rebels to be cannibals and bite off, at least like on the bright side, like at least it was kind of cooked, right? Like silver linings, right? Dózsa, a few of the rebels actually refused to do this, but when they did, they were promptly like hacked to pieces, just like Dózsa's brother was. Dózsa obviously eventually died from this, and the rebels who had actually obeyed the cannibalistic orders were set free. They were not executed. At this point, though, the rebellion ended, although it ended with over 70,000 peasants being tortured after Dózsa's execution. Hungary became a divided nation at this point, with the peasants losing trust in the existing nobility and the government at large. By 1526, the Ottomans, they're still around. They end up invading Hungary, ultimately leading to the separation of the country into the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg monarchy, and then the Principality of Transylvania. So our final story here is of Marco Antonio Bragadin, who was born in Venice at some point no one really cares to mention because I couldn't find that date. He initially sought a career as a lawyer, but as things tended to go during the Middle Ages, Marco ended up joining the Navy and was ultimately promoted to governor of a galley ship. I don't know what that means. Things were different 500 years ago. In 1569, he was elected captain of the Kingdom of Cyprus and then relocated to Famagusta, a wealthy port on the eastern side of the island of Cyprus. Realizing that the Ottoman Empire, still causing a bunch of problems here, because they got done with Hungary. Now they're still trying to expand their empire, and their next stop was Cyprus. And Marco Antonio Bragadin knew this. He knew they were going to invade because that's just what the Ottomans did. So Marco just assumed rule over the entire island and began doing everything he could to fortify it. The next year, Ottomans arrived, as expected, and began ransacking the entire island. Nicosia, the capital city, fell after 2 months, and then the Ottomans arrived at Famagusta on September 17th, 1570. Marco, he's still trying to lead. He leads the defense of the city for a few months with only 6,000 troops against 100,000 Ottomans. That's a lot. That's a lot of furniture. So much furniture. It's a stupid joke. Despite lasting longer than anyone thought, the Ottomans finally broke through the city's defenses in July of 1571, and then Marco surrendered less than a month later on August 1st. Now, because war has rules, right? Especially 500 years ago war, the Ottomans allowed the city's residents to evacuate or to remain under Ottoman authority. After 4 days of evacuations, a formal surrender ceremony was held where Marco offered Famagusta to Mustafa, the Ottoman general who had commanded everything and taken everything over. And at this point in a traditional surrender ceremony, the winning general would happily accept the terms and everyone would just kind of go about their new lives. Like, oh yeah, we took you over. Here's the new rules. All right. But we're just going to go back to normal, start repairing all the stuff we broke. We're all going to get along. It's going to be fine. Well, that's not what the Ottomans did, at least Mustafa. Because Mustafa accused Marco of slaughtering Ottoman prisoners and hiding weapons. And once he did that, he then took out a knife and sliced Marco's right ear off. And as Marco was shooting blood everywhere, Mustafa then ordered his guards to cut off Marco's nose and his other ear. And then, for some reason, Mustafa ordered every Christian remaining in the city to be killed. And like the Ottomans were Muslim, if you didn't know, but orders all the Christians on Cyprus to be killed. Marco somehow survives all of this. He spends 2 weeks in prison before he was dragged out of his cell, tied to a chair, and then hung from the mast of the Ottoman flagship. And then for a few hours or whatever, like people came up, taunted him like, ha, you lost, you suck. Blah, we win. We're Ottomans. We're great, even though no one remembers us. Anyway, but once everyone was done taunting him, Marco was taken to the city square in Famagusta, tied naked to a column, and then had his entire skin flayed off of his body while he was still alive. And I don't know at what point you die from that, but it's got just the most intense pain. And like, I don't know if a human being can survive after they've had all their skin removed from their body. Maybe they can. I don't know. Probably not. But once that was done, the rest of his body was quartered, just ripped apart, and then distributed as war trophies to the other Ottoman war generals. The Ottomans then took Marco's skin stuffed it with straw, and then sewed it back up into this weird, morbidly terrifying doll, and then just kept it as a trophy, which is insane to me. But like the Ottomans are very underrated in some of the insane stuff that they did, but this was a good example of that. All right, awful ways to die in the books. Just disgusting, right? Like those I think were worse than a lot of the serial killer deaths that we've covered. So let's do a quick recap and see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
Number 1, Arius blew his internal organs out of his butthole in the city street because someone prayed for it and God made it happen. Right. Number 2, György Dózsa led a rebellion of Hungarian peasants, and then he was fried on a heated iron throne and then had his own soldiers forcibly cannibalize his cooked open wounds. Insane. And then number 3, Marco Antonio Bragadin lost the battle to the Ottoman Empire, and for his efforts was flayed alive, quartered, and then had his skin stuffed with straw and turned into a weird, creepy doll. Next week on Our Weird World, we are looking at 3 stories of hijackers. There was this crazy period from like the late 60s, probably through like the mid 70s, where people figured out it was super duper easy, like ridiculously easy to hijack an entire commercial flight. And you could get whatever you wanted and take the plane wherever you wanted to go because there was no security. Like the reason that so much security, TSA pre-check lines, all that stuff, like I get it because you used to not have any of it. You used to just walk right into the airport, pick a flight and go. And then there were some dinglings who ruined that for everybody. And so we are going to look at 3 stories next week that all happened kind of in this period. It's the stories of Raphael Minichiello, the Ufkir coup, and the story of Garrett Trapnell. Just insane action movie style hijackings that kind of worked, but kind of didn't. So we'll look at those stories next week, but that's going to do it here this week. Thank you all for continuing to listen. Keep telling all your friends and keep it weird. You can tell the world you never was my girl. You can burn my clothes up when I'm gone. You can tell your friends just what a fool I've been and laugh and joke about me on the phone. You can tell my arms to go back to the farm. You can tell my feet to hit the floor. Or you can tell my lips to tell my fingertips they won't be reaching out for you no more. You can tell your ma I moved to Arkansas, or you can tell your dog to bite my leg, or tell your brother Cliff, whose fist can tell my lips he never really liked me anyway. Or tell your Aunt Louise, tell anything you please. Myself already knows I'm not okay. Or you can tell my eyes to watch out for my mind. It might be walking out on me one day. But don't tell my heart, my achy, breaky heart. I just don't think he'd understand. And if you tell my heart, my achy, breaky heart, he might blow up and kill this man.